Hi, I'm Marshall Sharpe, and you're watching For Art's Sake. Good morning, my name is Marshall Sharpe. I'm originally from Greensboro, North Carolina. I'm now a visiting assistant professor of art at Southern Illinois University in Edwardsville. I did my Bachelor of Arts in Art at Elon University in North Carolina, and my Master of Fine Arts in Painting at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Today I'll be talking about the group exhibition Family Ties here at the Gertz Gallery at Parkland College. And I'll be talking specifically about these 13 paintings that were my contribution for this exhibition. So I'll start with this side over here. And before I talk about the individual pieces, I'll give a little bit of background information. This series was created in 2018. And at the time, I'd just taken a year-long sabbatical to do some ancestry research. I was living in Hawaii at the time, and I got funding as a middle school English teacher to take that sabbatical and do this research. And I moved home to North Carolina to live with my dad's mother and began learning more about my maternal grandmother. Her name was Nancy Morgan. She passed away of breast cancer before I was born. I never met her, and I never knew very much about her. And so I was curious about her life, and I wanted to find images and stories, and really I wanted to build a relationship with this woman that I never knew. The work is inspired in part by the work of two lesbian women. One is Cheryl Dunye, a filmmaker, and she works in collaboration at times with Zoe Leonard, a photographer. The two of them collaborated on a film called The Watermelon Woman from the 1990s. And they were trying to research this woman, Faye Richards, a black lesbian woman, a movie star, and they couldn't find any information about her in any of the archives. So they were disappointed, but they decided to create their own fake archive about Faye Richards' life and make a film about it. That was The Watermelon Woman. So they staged all of these photographs, they hired an actress, they used very old school photography methods, and they created this beautiful archive that's now in the collection of the Whitney to kind of fill in a gap in the archive. They just weren't finding much visual representation of black lesbian women. So that was inspiration to me, and I decided to do the same thing with my grandmother. I didn't really have a relationship with her, and so I decided to create this archive. And in many ways, this is kind of a fake archive as well, based on the life of my grandmother. All of these paintings are based on images that I found in cardboard boxes, in drawers, in chests that I'd never seen before. And the images came to me in kind of a random order, and often I had no idea who the figures were, and I had to ask my mom to tell me who the people were in each of the images. So I'll start over here with this painting here. This is called Ross Was Great, but I Always Wanted a Sister. This is my grandmother right here on the left, and she had a brother named Ross, but I kind of put myself into her shoes and imagined that maybe she wanted a sister, and that was really me projecting. I had 3 sisters and always wanted a brother. And so I took a painting of her on her wedding day, and I just duplicated her twice. I kind of cut her out and glued her back on. It's like a multimedia collage. And so my process was, I started with this photograph, and it was a very small, black and white photograph. And then I created an oil painting on canvas based on that photograph. And I was using really large, unblended brushstrokes. I was influenced by Rebecca Campbell, and I loved her style of painting. But I felt like it was too close to the photograph. It wasn't clear why it needed to be a painting. I could have just printed the photo. And so I felt like I needed to push it farther. I started abstracting on the oil on canvas painting by laying the paintings on the floor or on a table, and mixing my oil paint with turpentine, really thinning it out, and then painting these kind of abstract, often fabric patterns over the piece, and then dripping isopropyl alcohol into it to create this kind of screen or scrim, a layer between the viewer and the figure. It wasn't really working, and I knew it, and my mentors knew it, and so one of my mentors, Ann Simpkins, a professor at Elon University in North Carolina, she told me, just go to FedEx, make a photograph of this painting, print out 10 copies, and then destroy them, scribble on them, get some crayons out, pour paint on them, tear them up, draw on them with a pencil, whatever you need to do. Take major risks with these images. They won't be so precious to you because you'll have 10 copies on paper, and then you might start to get something really interesting. And that's what I did, and that's what brought me to this work here. So this is actually a photograph of my oil on canvas painting, printed 11 by 14, and then I've taken that photograph of my painting, laid it on a table, and then repainted it with watered down acrylic paint. And oftentimes I paint with pipettes instead of brushes. As I lay the paint down on the canvas, it starts to mix together and swirl. I don't have full control or autonomy over what the paint does at that point. And I like that loss of control. I feel like conceptually it relates to my loss of control over my relationship with my grandmother. I also felt like it referenced memory in the way that memory is kind of liquid and it dissolves and then it appears and then it disappears at times. And I felt like it also referenced the kind of constructed nature of identity, where our identities are often based on the stories we tell ourselves. And they're not always true, but nonetheless, those stories become really important to our lives. And the same is true of these paintings. By creating this work, I felt like I was building a relationship with my grandmother. And to this day, I really do feel like I know her better as a result. This one is called A Tennessee Woman on a Tennessee Walker. And I showed this source image to my cousin, and she said, "Oh, this horse, that's a Tennessee Walker." And I didn't even know what that was. But she explained to me that the gait of the horse, the way the front legs are spaced from the back legs, can tell you that it's a Tennessee Walker. And I found out that she really loved horses. There was a lot of imagery of her riding horses. And it was kind of interesting because my mom was terrified of horses and never wanted to be around them. But my sisters and I independently had this love of horses growing up, and we didn't even know that our grandmother also had that interest. So sometimes it's interesting the way something as simple as a hobby could be passed down through the generations without anyone knowing it. This one is called Getting Married in Missouri Tonight, Please Don't Tell. This is my grandmother at the age of, I'm guessing, 16. I found out that she had been previously married. At 16, she ran away and married her high school sweetheart, and she had to go to Missouri to do that. When I found this image, I just guessed that she might be 16 in this image. And so I took this story that I'd heard about her getting married, and I attached it to this painting as kind of a visual representation of that moment. I really have no idea what was happening in this source image. Maybe it was a debutante photo of her kind of coming out to society. But it's kind of an example of how I'm creating this almost fictional narrative. I'm taking these stories that I've heard secondhand, thirdhand. I'm taking photographs that someone else took of her at this event, and I'm putting it together with these imagined stories, some based more on truth than others. And again, you're kind of seeing the watery acrylic paint cover the canvas and create this barrier between the viewer's ability to read the figure or fully understand the figure. This one is called the Gardens of Versailles. I know that she took a trip to Europe with some of her friends. I think it was in her late 20s, early 30s. I have her travel journal from that time. And when I came across this image, I just imagined that maybe she'd gone to the Gardens of Versailles one day. I have no idea if she really went. But I imagined her kind of standing here with her heels on, her purse, her hair is done. She's standing in front of this rose garden. There's these beautiful trees in the background. It's kind of a cloudy day, and the trees are kind of melting into the sky, and the roses are kind of melting into her body. And I just loved the way this image came together. I've probably painted this same painting 15 times, and that's one of my strategies. I paint the same image over and over and over and over again until I get something that I feel is really interesting or groundbreaking. I'll move over to here now. This one is called Why'd Her Daddy by a Pet Lion. And in this image, this is my mother right here, her best friend Janet, and then my uncle Will over here. And when I was interviewing Janet, I asked her to tell me stories about her childhood. And she told me this hilarious story about growing up, how she and my mom were playing in the front yard one day, and the mailman delivered this huge wooden crate, massive, to their front door. And the crate kind of had slats in it. You could see through it. And so they ran up to the crate to see what was inside, and there was a massive African lion inside of this crate. And they were terrified. You know, they were little girls, and they just ran away screaming. And later, they came to find out that Janet's dad had gone on a hunting trip and had shot this African lion and sent it to the taxidermy, and the taxidermist was delivering it to their house in this wooden crate for them to display in their home. And it was such a wild story. I'd never heard a story like that. You know, I didn't even know that you could hunt an African lion or have one taxidermied for your house. And it just showed me how different my mom's life was and her friends' life were in Memphis, kind of in the 50s and 60s. So again, I have no idea, you know, what the context of this image was, but I attached that story to this painting as a way of helping me to remember that story and build a relationship with my grandmother, and in this case, kind of my mom and her friends. So this painting is called Here's Your Baby, Mrs. Morgan. Now let me get your camera. And I showed my mom this source image, and she said, oh my gosh, that was probably the one and only time my grandmother or her mother held this baby. You know, it was probably a staged photo. And she said that because my grandmother had a very vibrant social life, and she was often outside of the home, and she had hired other people to raise my mom and my uncle. And so she felt like this was a moment when Nancy Morgan was kind of sitting on the couch holding her baby. And I could feel, you know, some tension there when my mom was telling the story. But when I looked at this source image, I felt like there was this gentleness and this beautiful kindness here in the way that she was kind of holding this child. And so I kind of emphasized that by adding this white paint as if it was a white dress going down to the floor over top of her. And then the baby and the hands are kind of revealed. They're not hidden by that white paint. This one is titled The Duke and Duchess of Windsor. We're a very nice couple. My grandmother, I mentioned earlier, took that kind of transatlantic cruise. I think it was on like the USS Anne, and she writes in her travel journal that the Duke and Duchess of Windsor were on the boat with them, traveling first class. And I don't think she met them, but I think she saw them, you know, in the dining room one evening or something like that. And it was such a fascinating moment in her life, something I'd never known. And so when I came across this source image, I felt like, okay, well, maybe she's on a cruise ship. You know, she has like her hat here, she's got a newspaper, her purse, a little scarf, and she's holding onto the handrail, and this is water in the background and the sky, and then this is kind of the ship behind her. Who knows what was really happening in that image, but I just attached that memory to this source image, to this painting, and it kind of makes me laugh to think about that voyage and the way that people used to travel to Europe on a ship, a cruise ship, instead of getting on an airplane. This is the last one that I'll be talking about, and it's titled One More Chance Encounter, and I would have asked him on a date. And I love this painting. I love the joy that you can see in both figures and the way that the paint kind of interacted with their faces and their clothes. I found this hilarious story through interviewing family and friends that my grandfather worked at a bank, and before they were dating or had really met, my grandmother would show up at the bank, and she had a friend who worked at the bank, and so she would show up casually around lunchtime and just chat with her friend and then leave. And I think she was just really hoping that my grandfather would ask her on a date, and she kept showing up at the bank around lunchtime, and he would just never take that first step. And so the story goes that finally, he finally asked her to go out for a drink, and she had decided that that was her very last time she was showing up at the bank at lunchtime, and if he didn't ask her out that day, then the next time she was going to ask him on a date. And I loved that story because it showed her independence and her boldness and her courage. That would be very unusual for a woman in the 50s to ask a man on a date. And it actually kind of reminded me of my mom and some of my sisters who also just have that boldness, that independence, that courage. So thank you so much for listening to me tell some of these stories about my grandmother and the paintings that I've created, the process that I went through in creating them. I hope that I can honor my grandmother's memory through this work. Of course, through the research, I found out that, like everyone, she was a complex character. There was good, there was bad, there was ugly. It was all present in her life. And that helped her to be a more real character, a 360-degree character, and not just this idealized image that maybe one person might have tried to create her as. Instead, she became a real person to me. So I love these paintings. I have many of the similar images hanging in my home, and I always talk to my students and encourage them to use this process to create their own work, either to research their own ancestry, or if they don't know their ancestors, to create a fake archive of what their ancestors might have been, who they might have been, where they might have gone, and to use their creativity to fill in blanks in their personal archive. So many of my students have created beautiful work about this, especially in my advanced painting class. And it's a joy for me because I've had so many fabulous mentors that have invested in me and guided me along the way. And now I'm trying to do that same thing for my students. So thank you.